October 26th, 1942. A muddy jungle trail, somewhere east of the Matanikau River on Guadalcanal. A ghost surrendered for a can of meat. He did not surrender to a rifle butt, or the glint of a bayonet. He surrendered to a smell. It was an impossible smell in this world of rot and decay, the scent of fried pork, salty and sublime, hanging thick and heavy in the humid air. The jungle itself smelled only of mud, of decomposition, of the metallic tang of fear. For weeks this had been the entire universe. But now, this. Private First Class Saito Kenji, a boy of 19 who had once dreamed of being a teacher in Kyoto, stumbled out from behind a screen of giant, dripping ferns. His Arisaka rifle was gone, swallowed by the sucking mud days ago. His uniform was a collection of green and brown rags clinging to a frame that was no longer human. He was a skeleton animated by a flicker of desperate will. His comrades had a name for this condition, a quiet whisper for the hollowing out of a man. The gashibyo, the starvation disease. It was a slow, creeping death that started in the belly and worked its way to the soul, leaving behind an automaton that could still walk, still obey, but could no longer truly fight. They had been eating boiled tree bark, snails, the occasional lizard if they were lucky. Then came the whispers. They started near the American perimeter, rumors carried on the night air from one starving platoon to another, passed through the lines like a dangerous contagion. Rumors of a magical food, a food of the gods, some said. They called it supamu. On the American side, they saw only madness. The first prisoners taken this way were isolated cases, written off as battle-fatigued or simply insane. A young Marine from the 1st Division wrote home about it. Found a Jap today. He wasn't fighting, he was crying, pointing at my buddy's sea rations like it was the Holy Grail. The official reports filed under the mundane heading POW Debriefs, Sector Gamma, Oktiasarinat. 42, noted the bizarre fixation with clinical detachment. But the pattern was undeniable. It was growing. A second lieutenant in G2 intelligence, a man fresh from a desk at Princeton, tried to make sense of it in a memo to his superior. The emerging behavioral anomaly among enemy captives is statistically significant, he wrote. Subjects exhibit an obsessive-compulsive focus on a single non-essential ration item, Type C tinned pork shoulder. They are often non-responsive to standard interrogation protocols until this item is presented as an inducement. Recommend further study. The reply from his commanding major, a hardened veteran of the Banana Wars, was scrawled in the margins. Study what? They're starving. Give them the damn pork and ask them where the artillery is. But it was more than just hunger. Starving men had been a feature of warfare for millennia. This was different. This was a kind of worship. How could a simple rectangular tin of processed meat, a food American soldiers themselves joked about, calling it ham that failed its physical, or meatloaf without basic training, systematically dismantle the warrior code of an army sworn to die for their emperor? Official histories of the Guadalcanal campaign, with their sweeping arrows on maps and chronicles of grand naval clashes, mention Japanese starvation as a footnote. A tactical advantage. A logistical failure on the part of the enemy. They do not mention the can. They do not mention the smell. They do not mention the rumors that turned enemy soldiers into supplicants. The real story, buried for over 50 years in archives stamped top secret, was never about tactics. It was about psychology. It was the story of an ideological war fought not with bullets, but with the shocking, overwhelming evidence of an enemy's abundance. The Americans didn't just have more guns and more ships. They had more everything, right down to the fatty, salty, calorie-dense food they could afford to discard. A single can of Spam, lost from a pack or casually tossed aside by a Marine patrol, became a more potent piece of propaganda than any leaflet drop. It was a symbol, a promise of a world beyond the green hell of the jungle, a world of impossible plenty. It was a deep-level psychological operation that nobody had ever planned. A file, eventually compiled by a little-known branch of the Office of Naval Intelligence, was codenamed Operation Provisions. Its contents, declassified piece by painful piece, tell a story of profound collapse. It details the precise nutritional science that made Spam the perfect antidote to the thiamine deficiency ravaging the Japanese forces. It contains transcripts where soldiers describe the first taste not as food, but as a resurrection. It chronicles the quiet, unauthorized decisions by American NCOs on the front line to use their personal rations as tools of surrender, long before any official policy was conceived. This is the story of that file. This is the story of how that simple can of meat became the unlikely lure, the totem of a different kind of power that helped break an army, one starving soldier at a time. July 2nd, 1942. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 6 months. 6 months of running. The telegrams arrived every day. Another ship lost, another island fallen. Pearl Harbor was a harbor of ghosts, of twisted metal and weeping steel beneath the placid water. The Philippines were gone. Singapore was gone. The Dutch East Indies, gone. A red sun rising over half the globe. The line had been drawn at Midway, a miracle of code-breaking and courage. A miracle? But miracles were not a strategy. The Japanese did not stop. They kept pushing. South. Always south. The intelligence was thin. A whisper on the shortwave from a lone Australian coast watcher, hiding in the mountains of a place called Bougainville. A grainy photograph taken from 30,000 feet by a B-17 flying on fumes. The photo showed a scar, a fresh wound cut into the endless green of a jungle island. It was long, it was flat, it was unmistakable, an airfield. On an island nobody in Washington could find on a map. The folder was called Operation Watchtower. The island was Guadalcanal, a name that sounded like a disease. 90 miles long, 25 miles wide. A spine of volcanic mountains covered in a choking, malarial jungle that drank the light. Hot, wet, rotten. A place God had forgotten. But the Japanese had not. Their engineers were there. Their laborers were there. And soon, their bombers would be there. The airfield, that was the key. An unsinkable aircraft carrier sitting directly on the lifeline. The vital shipping lane between America and Australia. From that field, Japanese twin-engine bombers could strike convoys. They could isolate Australia. They could win the war. They could win it right there, in that fetid jungle. Admiral Ernest King in Washington saw the picture. He saw the future. He pounded the table. "Go," he ordered. "You have to go now." The plan was thrown together. A scramble. Not enough ships, not enough men, not enough time. They called it a shoestring operation. A gamble. A desperate, hopeful, insane gamble. Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, commander of the South Pacific Force, was hesitant. He saw the risks. He saw the long, vulnerable supply lines. He saw the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But the order came down. From King. From Nimitz. Go. The force gathered in the waters off Fiji. 82 ships in total. A fleet of gray ghosts sailing toward the Solomon Islands. Toward Guadalcanal. Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift commanded the ground troops. The 1st Marine Division. They were the old breed, forged in the banana wars of Central America. They had never fought the Japanese. They had never fought a war like this. They were told it would be easy. Seize the airfield. The Navy would protect them. Then a relief force would arrive. In and out. That was the promise. A map was spread on a table aboard the flagship, the USS Macaulay. It showed a curve of land, Lunga Point, a river called the Matnikau, another called the Tenaru. Offshore, a small volcanic cone, Savo Island. The invasion fleet would split. The main force would land on Guadalcanal. Smaller units would hit the nearby islands. Tulagi, Gavutu, Tanambago, where a Japanese seaplane base was located. Those were the targets. August 7th, 1942. The ship slipped through the channels under the cover of a rain squall. A perfect approach. The Japanese were asleep. At dawn, the big guns of the cruisers and destroyers opened fire. The world exploded. On Tulagi and Gavutu, the fighting was savage. A preview of horrors to come. The Japanese defenders fought from caves, from dugouts, to the last man. A bloody, brutal business. But on Guadalcanal, silence. The Marines of the 1st and 5th Regiments waited ashore at Red Beach. They moved inland, through the tall, sharp kunai grass. They expected an ambush at every turn. Nothing. They found the enemy's camp. Tents, workshops, ice-making plants. Breakfast was still cooking. Rice and fish. The Japanese construction troops, mostly Korean laborers and a small naval guard force, had fled. They had melted into the jungle. By the end of the next day, the Marines had it. The prize. The gravel runway, 2,600 feet long, carved from the coconut plantation. They named it Henderson Field. For a Marine pilot, Major Lofton Henderson, who died leading his squadron at Midway. A ghost in exchange for a piece of ground. It seemed too easy. The first part of the plan, the only part that was clear, was done. The airfield was theirs. The men worked to finish the runway using captured Japanese equipment. They secured the perimeter. They waited for the supplies to be fully unloaded from the transports anchored in the Sound. The sky was clear. The sea was calm. A false dawn. Then came the reports. Whispers at first. A reconnaissance plane from the carrier Wasp was missing. Another spotted enemy ships, a powerful force. Cruisers, destroyers, steaming south at high speed. Down the channel between the islands, the men were already calling the slot. They were coming from their massive base at Rabaul. They were coming for the transports. They were coming for the Marines. Night fell on August 8th. The Allied warships under the British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley took up their patrol stations around Savo Island. They were tired. They were overconfident. They did not know what was coming. Out on the dark water, a lookout on the cruiser USS Chicago saw a flare. Then another. He saw the silhouette of a plane. But it was too late. The sea itself was about to burn. And the real Guadalcanal campaign was just beginning. June 17, 1944. Pier 45, San Francisco. For every one American soldier who stepped onto a transport ship, 10 tons of equipment followed him. 10 tons. That was the weight of 2 adult elephants, for every single man. Nobody in Tokyo believed the numbers. They thought it was propaganda. Bluster. But the facts were there, written in the endless columns of shipping manifests. Facts are always truthful, especially when they are written in steel and stacked on a pier. The noise was constant, a symphony of industry. The shriek of cranes, the growl of truck engines, the shouts of foremen. Major Frank Hollister of the Army Quartermaster Corps, 42 years old and balding from stress, watched it all from an overlook. He didn't see men or machines, he saw a river of material flowing west. Crates of .50 caliber ammunition, barrels of aviation fuel, boxes of K-rations, pallets of medical plasma, jeeps, half-tracks, bulldozers, even prefabricated barracks, an unending stream. Hollister had read the latest report that morning. The folder was called Logistical Analysis, Pacific Theater, Q2 1944. It didn't talk about courage or tactics. It talked about tonnage. It talked about efficiency. It talked about victory measured in crates per hour. The machine never stopped, not for a day, not for an hour. The report had a special section. Enemy logistical capability assessed as critical. Critical was a polite word, a bureaucratic word. What it meant was starvation. The Allied navies and air forces had thrown a net across the Pacific. A vast, invisible, deadly net. They called it interdiction, a clean word for a dirty business. Sinking supply ships. It was a simple, brutal equation. No fuel for the planes. No ammunition for the guns. No food for the men. The river was a one-way street, and it was not flowing to Japan. Across that same ocean in a humid, malarial stretch of jungle near Wewak, New Guinea, the silence was broken only by the buzz of insects. Corporal Kenji Tanaka of the Japanese 18th Army was 22 years old. He did not think about tonnage. He thought about his stomach. His stomach was a hollow drum, an empty, aching pit. He lay under a giant fern, its leaves slick with moisture, and tried not to move. Moving burned calories. Calories he did not have. He had not seen a full ration in 3 months. 3 months. His last meal had been a boiled paste made from palm pith. It tasted like sawdust. It offered the nutrition of sawdust. Before that, roots, insects, bitter leaves. The men called it green rations. Sometimes a lucky patrol found a lizard or a snake. The sick were no longer sent to the aid station. The aid station had no medicine. The sick were left where they lay. It was a mercy. A quiet, desperate mercy. They whispered about the ships, the supply ships from Palau or from the Philippines. Rumors kept the men alive longer than the roots did. The Moji Maru was coming. The Kenwa Maru had broken through the blockade. Someone's cousin in division headquarters had heard it. Maybe from a radio message. Maybe from a captured flyer. The rumors were ghosts. Phantoms of hope in a graveyard of an army. But the ships never came. They lay on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea, or rusting in the shallows of the Caroline Islands. Their hulls were peeled open like cans. Cans of men and supplies that now fed the fish. Sunk by dive bombers from Henderson Field. Sunk by torpedoes from the USS Wahoo or the USS Tong. Sunk by the relentless, grinding math of American production that Major Hollister oversaw from his pier in San Francisco. That was the truth. The unspoken, terrible truth. Private First Class Jimmy Red O'Malley from South Boston sat on an ammunition crate on Bougainville. He pried open a can with his P-38 can opener. Spam, slices of pink, processed meat slid out into his mess kit. "I'd kill for a real steak," he grumbled to his buddy. He cursed it. He made fun of it, but he ate it. He ate it all. It was fuel. It was life. It was a guarantee that arrived on a ship, every week like clockwork. Corporal Kenji Tanaka watched a fat, iridescent beetle crawl slowly across a decaying leaf. He thought about the tiny morsel of protein it represented. He thought about the effort it would take to reach out, to catch it, to eat it raw. He wondered if he had the strength. He did not curse the beetle. He prayed he could catch it. The difference between a can of Spam and a beetle was the difference between two worlds. It was the difference between winning and dying. The high command in Tokyo knew, of course they knew. They had their own reports filled with their own polite, bureaucratic words. The situation was described as strategic self-sufficiency. A soldier's duty was to endure, to forage, to fight with spirit when weapons were gone. The propaganda posters showed determined soldiers, bayonets fixed, charging toward victory. They did not show men boiling tree bark. They did not show men whose skin was stretched tight over their bones, whose eyes were dull with hunger. The spirit could not digest leaves. The spirit could not stop a .50 caliber bullet. That's how an army dies, not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet, agonizing rot of starvation, one man at a time. Frank Hollister in San Francisco was loading the bullets, but the submarines and the bombers, they were loading the hunger. And the hunger was the most effective weapon of all. In the jungle near Wewak, Kenji Tanaka closed his eyes. He tried to summon the image of his mother's face, her warm smile in their small house in Kagoshima. But the image was blurry, indistinct. A new vision replaced it, sharp and painfully clear. A simple bowl, a white ceramic bowl, filled to the brim with steaming perfect rice. A ghost he could almost taste. A ghost that would never arrive. January 5th, 1943. Austin, Minnesota. The smell was not of cooking meat. It was the smell of industry. Hot metal, sterilizing steam, and a faint salty promise that hung in the frozen Minnesota air. 100 million pounds. That was the number whispered on the factory floor. The target from the War Department for the year: 100 million pounds of the stuff in the little blue cans. Nobody could comprehend the number. Not really. It was just a figure on a piece of paper from Washington, D.C. A piece of paper that smelled like authority. But on the line, where women in hairnets and men with weary eyes worked under the hard electric lights, the number became real. Can by can by can. Each one a 12-ounce brick of pork shoulder, ham, salt, and potato starch. A brick of hope, or a brick of dread, depending on who you asked. The jungle did not care about hope. The jungle cared only about rot. It rotted everything. Leather boots grew green fur overnight. Cotton shirts dissolved into damp, flimsy webs after a week. Letters from home turned to pulp. Photographs of sweethearts blurred into gray ghosts. Even the steel on a K-bar knife would weep with rust if you didn't oil it. Constantly. The heat was a wet blanket. The rain was a constant drum. Everything decayed, everything fell apart. Nothing lasted, except the can. The little rectangular can with the bright yellow letters. Spam. It sat in the mud, half submerged in swampy water, for days, for weeks. It didn't rust, it didn't leak. The paper label might peel away, but the metal held. The contents remained sterile, safe, predictable. 20-year-old Private First Class Michael Sully Sullivan from South Boston wrote a letter to his sister. A letter he kept wrapped in a sheet of oilcloth. They drop it from planes. It bounces. We dig it out of the mud, we open it up. It's always the same. I don't know if I love it or hate it, but it's here. It's always here. That was its power. Its simple, obstinate, physical presence. Inside the Pentagon, in a quiet, smoke-filled office of the Quartermaster Corps, a report lay open on a desk. The folder was stamped "Confidential." The title was blunt. Sustenance Analysis, South Pacific Theater. It was filled with charts, tables, numbers. Calories per ounce, 89. Protein, 7 grams. Fat, 16 grams. Shelf life, indefinite. The report stated that in conditions of extreme humidity and fluctuating temperatures, 50% of dry biscuit rations were lost to mold. 30% of preserved butter tins failed. But the failure rate for canned spiced ham was less than 1%. Less than 1%. A logistical miracle. A statistic that saved lives. It was food as engineering. Reliable, durable, American. It was more than food. It was a message. Every C-47 Skytrain that lumbered over the Owen Stanley Mountains in New Guinea, kicking out crate after crate of Spam to the exhausted men of the 32nd Infantry Division, was a statement. Every landing craft that hit the beaches of Tarawa, its hold stacked high with the blue and yellow cans, was an argument. An argument for industrial might. An argument for logistical supremacy. The whispers from the front lines were stark. The intelligence reports confirmed it. A captured Japanese soldier's diary found on Guadalcanal had a desperate, scrawled entry. No rice for 10 days. We eat roots. We eat the bark from trees. The Americans, they have meat. In cans. They have so much they use it for target practice. 600 million cans by the end of the war. 600 million. That's a wall of cans stretching from San Francisco to Tokyo. And back again. Picture it. A clearing in the Bougainville jungle, the air thick with the smell of cordite and damp earth. A close-up. A vintage Spam can, its label peeling slightly, sits on a discarded ammo box. The background is a blur of giant ferns and dark, watchful trees. A Marine, his face a mask of dried sweat and grime, his helmet pushed back on his head, slices a pink slab from the can with his bayonet. He doesn't cook it. There's no time. No fire. He just eats it. Cold. Around him, 3 other Marines do the same. Johnson, Kowalski, Rodriguez, Chen. The faces of America, they eat in silence. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic chewing. In that moment, it wasn't a joke. It wasn't a mystery meat. It was fuel. It was a connection to a world of clean factories and full refrigerators, a world that seemed a million years away. It was a taste of home, a strange, salty, tinned version of home. The soldiers gave it names, of course they did. They had to cope with the sheer, unrelenting monotony of it. Ham that didn't pass its physical. Meatloaf without basic training. The GI's steak. Spare parts animal meat. Rumors spread about its contents. Maybe from the Navy, maybe from the cooks. They said it was anything and everything. Lips, snouts, hooves, tails. The jokes became a kind of currency. A shared language of complaint that bonded them together. A Marine on Peleliu was heard to have said, "I'm going to buy a pig farm when I get home. I won't raise them. I'll just apologize to them, one by one." And everyone laughed, because they understood they made it their own. Sliced thin and fried until the edges were crisp and black. Diced and mixed with powdered eggs for a morning scramble. Mashed with cracker crumbs and molded into patties, then fried in bacon grease. The Spam fritter. The jungle burger. The Saipan steak. It was a testament to ingenuity, to the human need to impose order and variety on a universe of bland conformity. It was a small act of rebellion, a way of saying, you can send us to hell, you can feed us the same thing every day, but we will still find a way to make it ours. We will still add our own spice. It became an emblem, not of culinary excellence, but of reliability. In a world where your friend could be alive 1 minute and gone the next, where the ground beneath your feet could explode, where disease could steal you in your sleep. Spam was a constant. It was a known quantity. That familiarity, even when bred from contempt, was a form of comfort. It was a morale booster, not because it was delicious, but because it was there. Always there. A 12-ounce anchor to reality. But the numbers kept growing. The orders from the War Department became ever larger, ever more demanding. 100 million pounds became 200 million. The factories in Austin, in Fremont, in Dubuque, they worked around the clock. Lights burned in every room, even when the news from the front was good, even when victory seemed certain. Someone was planning for something more. Someone was looking beyond the jungles, beyond the beaches, beyond the end of the war itself. The logistics officers, the men who thought in terms of tons and shipping lanes, saw something else in the data. They saw a beachhead, a foothold not in enemy territory, but in the global consciousness. In the quiet, document-filled archives of the Quartermaster Corps, a new folder appeared in late 1944. It was thin. Its contents were speculative. The folder was called Post-War Sustenance Logistics. They whispered it had another name, a code name, Project Blue and Yellow. The war for the islands was almost over. The war for the world's dinner table? That was just getting started. August 9th, 1944. The Ibdi Pocket, Biak Island. They found the diaries first, not rifles, not grenades. Small, sweat-stained books tucked inside rotting tunics. The post-action report from the 162nd Infantry Regiment mentioned them. A minor detail, an afterthought. But the words inside were not minor. They screamed. Sergeant Matsuo Ito, 22nd Infantry Division. His last entry was written in a shaky hand. The ink was blurred by rain or maybe tears. It spoke of hunger, a deep, gnawing hunger that erased thought. That erased humanity. The jungle offered nothing. Roots that tasted of poison. Lizards that were too fast. Comrades who grew too still. Day 47 without a rice ball. 47 days? Then he wrote about the Americans. He did not write about their guns or their tanks. He wrote about their trash. He saw a pile of it near a captured bunker, a mountain of discarded things, and among the brass casings and empty cigarette packs he saw the cans. Dozens of them. Blue and yellow cans with a picture of meat. Perfectly good meat, half-eaten and thrown away. Thrown away? That was the word that broke him. The casualness of it. The sheer, impossible abundance. It was a weapon nobody had designed. A captured private, his name was Kobayashi, spoke of it during an interrogation on Hollandia. The intelligence officer, a young lieutenant from Yale, took notes. The folder was codenamed Aphrodite. It had nothing to do with love. It was about morale. The report stated the subject displays little fear of conventional arms. His psychological collapse appears directly linked to the observation of Allied ration distribution. The report continued. He refers to the canned meat product Spam as a kind of magic. He believed it was limitless. He and his squad mates concluded that an army that could afford to waste such a resource could not possibly be defeated. It could not possibly be defeated. The rumor spread through the caves and tunnels of the Pacific like a fever. They whispered it on Peleliu. They muttered it in the disease-ridden swamps of Leyte. The Americans did not need supply lines. Their food grew in their packs. They had so much, they paved their roads with it. Ludicrous stories. Desperate fantasies. But they felt true. The truth was in the smell. The smell of frying pork shoulder and ham that drifted over no man's land at dawn. A smell of home, of safety, of a full belly. For the starving Japanese soldiers, it was the smell of their own funeral pyre. It was the scent of defeat. They called it the president's meat. Roosevelt's secret weapon. Each can was a personal insult from the American leader. A little piece of the mainland sent to mock their emperor, to mock their sacrifice, to mock their swollen bellies and hollow eyes. It was not warfare. It was something worse. It was contempt. One soldier, a Corporal Shima, was found wandering into an American perimeter near the West Caves. He was skeletal, a walking ghost. He ignored the rifles pointed at his chest. He was shuffling toward the company kitchen. He just wanted to see with his own eyes if the stories were true, if the supply of meat was truly endless. The final report from Project Aphrodite was brief. It concluded that the psychological impact of C rations and K rations, specifically the canned meat components, was a significant and unforeseen factor in accelerating enemy surrender in isolated garrisons. Unforeseen, unplanned, accidental. That was the most terrifying part. It wasn't a plot, it was simply a fact. A fact of American power. The power to produce, to ship, to supply, and to waste. An industrial engine so vast its exhaust fumes alone were enough to poison the enemy's will to fight. It made their own struggle seem so small, so pointless. Men who would charge into machine gun fire without a second thought? Men who would hold a grenade to their own chest. These same men saw a half-empty can of Spam lying in the mud, and their spirit broke. It was a symbol of a gap that could not be crossed, not with bravery, not with honor, not with death. The war for them was no longer against men. It was against a factory thousands of miles away, a factory that never slept. And you can't kill a factory with a bayonet. August 9th, 1944, the Ibdi Pocket Biak Island. They found the diaries first, not rifles, not grenades. Small, sweat-stained books tucked inside the rotting tunics of Japanese dead. The post-action report from the 41st Infantry Division was clinical, a document of ordnance expended and objectives secured. It detailed the grim, necessary work of clearing the caves with flamethrowers and satchel charges. Mopping up. But attached to the back, almost an afterthought, was a handwritten memorandum from a Captain Miller. G2 Intelligence. Miller was a former anthropology professor from Columbia. He saw things other men missed. He saw patterns in the filth and the chaos. His memo told another story, a story of paper and ink and hunger. The entries were all the same desperation written in a dozen different hands. Hunger, sickness, the jungle rot that ate a man's skin, the flies that laid eggs in open wounds, the endless droning fear, hunger, and then a new word, a foreign word, scrawled with the last vestiges of strength. The characters were shaky, barely legible, drawn by a starving hand. Supamu. Supamu. Private First Class Haro Sato, service number unknown, had filled his last page with it. A mantra of the damned. His final entry, dated 2 days before the assault, was just that single word. Repeated. Over and over again until the pencil tip broke. Supamu, Supamu, Supamu. It wasn't a prayer, it was a destination. But how? How did a boy from a village outside Kyoto learn this strange, guttural word in a cave on Biak Island? The answer wasn't in the caves. It was in a prefabricated hut back at Hollandia, inside a locked filing cabinet. The folder was stamped Top Secret. Its title was simple, almost childish. Passed to a friend. Inside were the leaflets, hundreds of them, the artifacts of a new kind of war. The psychological warfare branch was learning. Learning fast, they were staffed by oddities. Admen from Madison Avenue, Japanese-American linguists from California, sociologists who thought war was just a complex social problem with a violent solution. Maybe from OSS. Maybe from a darker corner of the alphabet soup. Nobody asked, they just produced. Leaflet number 101, dropped by the thousands from lumbering B-25s. They fluttered down over Biak, Saipan, Tinian. A simple thing, on cheap paper that felt impossibly clean in the jungle grime. On one side, a line drawing, not a cartoon. A technical illustration, precise and clear. A rectangular can of meat, a key, inserted and turning. The promise of an easy opening. Beneath it, text, in perfect formal Japanese. This is a food of your enemy. It is plentiful. It is nourishing. It gives him strength. No mention of surrender, not yet. No talk of ideology or emperor, just the image. And the promise. The promise of a full stomach. Sergeant Major Kenjiro Abe, 28th Infantry Regiment, a veteran of the Manchurian Campaign, a man who had endured unimaginable hardship. He walked out of a cave near the Parai Defile, his hands held high above his head. He was not carrying a white flag. He was carrying Leaflet 101. The interrogation report is dry, terse. Subject stated he was motivated by extreme food scarcity and propaganda leaflet. But the debriefer, a Nisei corporal from Hawaii named Jimmy Tanaka, added an unofficial note on a separate sheet. A note that never made it into the official file. He was shaking, not from fear. I think it was hunger. He pointed at the picture and whispered the word. Supamu. He asked for it by name. He wanted to know if the picture was real, if we really had so much. Just like that, the myth of the samurai spirit dissolving for a 12-ounce can of pork shoulder. And then there were more. It was a secret contagion. First a trickle, then a stream. Men emerging from the jungle, from caves honeycombed into the coral rock, from spider holes you could step on without seeing. They were walking skeletons. Yellowed skin stretched tight over bone, eyes sunk deep into their skulls. But they clutched the paper promises. Some were folded into perfect squares. Some were crumpled and stained with mud and blood. Yamada, Ito, Suzuki, Kobayashi, Watanabe, Takahashi. Ito had not eaten meat in 6 months. Watanabe had seen his captain execute a man for hoarding a single moldy rice ball. They all told the same story. Days, weeks without food, the gnawing emptiness. The bodies of their comrades left where they fell. And then the leaflets, floating down from the sky like mocking gods, gods of pork shoulder and processed ham. Then the main thing started. PWB learned. They grew bolder. They added a new element, a call to action. The I Cease Resistance Pass, a ticket to another world. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card, printed in English on one side and Japanese on the other. The English side was for the benefit of the nervous GI with a carbine. The bearer of this pass is a Japanese soldier who has chosen to cease resistance. Treat him well. See that he gets food, water, and medical attention. The Japanese side was carefully crafted by the Nisei linguists. It promised good treatment, water, food, medical care, good treatment. That was the key, not honorable surrender. That was a contradiction a Japanese soldier could not resolve. But good treatment, that was a practical matter. That was survival. Rumors had trickled back from the first prisoners. Rumors of full bellies and clean beds. The Americans, they whispered in the dark, had so much food they just gave it away. An unimaginable, impossible fortune. On Okinawa, May 27th, 1945, a different island, same story. A patrol from the 7th Infantry Division moving cautiously through the ruins of a village near Shuri. They smelled it first, a thin, acrid smoke. They found a lone Japanese soldier. He was trying to cook something over a tiny, smokeless fire made of twigs. A lizard, impaled on a stick. He saw them. He froze. His hand did not go for his Arisaka rifle, which lay a few feet away. It went for a piece of paper tucked inside his tunic. The patrol leader, a 21-year-old lieutenant from Cleveland named Harris, saw the leaflet. He'd seen them before. He lowered his weapon. The soldier stood up slowly. He bowed his head. He held out the leaflet, the I Cease Resistance Pass, like a sacred offering. He pointed to a small illustration in the corner, a picture of a can. Then he pointed to his own mouth. He didn't speak a word of English. He didn't have to. Everyone understood. He wanted Spam, 1 can of meat. 12 ounces. For a Japanese soldier starving in a cave, it was more than a meal. It was a psychological atom bomb. It was a symbol of everything they lacked, a symbol of an enemy that could project this much power, this much surplus across 6,000 miles of ocean. Their officers had told them stories of American weakness, of spiritual decay, but this was not weakness. This was power, industrial power, agricultural power, the power of a nation that could feed its armies, its civilians, and still have enough left over to bribe its enemies into submission. Power you could hold in your hand. Power you could open with a key. Power you could eat. It was a weapon more effective than a bayonet because it didn't just kill the body. It killed the will. The official histories rarely mention it. The general spoke of strategy, of firepower, of courage and sacrifice, but in the G2 files, in the interrogation transcripts, in the margins of after-action reports, the truth was there. Written in pencil and faded ink. A new weapon had been deployed, a weapon cooked up not in a munitions plant but in Austin, Minnesota. And there was another file, deeper, more secret. Its cover was blank, but the men in PWB called it the Singing Canaries. It wasn't about surrender, not anymore. It was about cooperation. It was about prisoners who, after a few square meals of Spam and eggs, began to talk. They talked about fortifications, troop movements, artillery positions, morale. They gave up everything. They drew maps on the back of the surrender leaflets themselves, all for a taste of the enemy's impossible strength and for a chance to live. August 7th, 1942, Lunga Point, Guadalcanal. They hit the beach with 3 days of food. The planners in comfortable offices thousands of miles away decided that was enough. 3 days for 17,000 men. The planners were always wrong. Then the Navy left. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, he was afraid for his carriers. The Saratoga, the Enterprise, the Wasp. He saw ghosts of battles past, of ships burning, so he pulled them out. The Marines were alone, stranded on an island of jungle and death. Their supplies, mountains of crates and boxes, sat piled on the beach. A perfect target. A monument to a plan already falling apart. The Japanese had a plan, too. They called it the Tokyo Express. Fast destroyers, sleek gray killers, slipping down the channel they called the Slot. They came every night. A nightly parade of ghosts. They brought fresh troops. They brought big guns. They brought colonels and generals with sharp swords and sharper orders. But they could not bring food, not enough. A destroyer is built for speed, for torpedoes, for death. It is not a grocery wagon. That was a simple fact. A brutal fact. The Americans had their own express, the Cactus Express. Old cargo ships, slow transports, rust buckets crewed by men who knew the odds. They sailed from Espiritu Santo. They sailed from Noumea. They steamed into what the sailors called Iron Bottom Sound, a graveyard of steel where the ghosts of the Canberra, the Quincy, the Vincennes lay silent in the deep. They ran the gauntlet of submarines and bombers. For what? For ammunition, for aviation fuel, for mail, and for food. Specifically for a 12-ounce tin of processed pork shoulder and ham. Spam. Back in the States, it was a punchline. A cheap meal for a cheap time. On Guadalcanal, it was currency, it was hope. It was a greasy, salty, beautiful promise, delivered from a world that still had factories and electricity in Minnesota. A report filed by a quartermaster sergeant named Henderson was found in the archives at Quantico. The folder was labeled Miscellaneous Cactus. It stated, morale is not sustained by rhetoric but by regular caloric intake. We could have lost the island for want of canned meat. He didn't write spam. He didn't have to. The USS Alchiba, a simple cargo ship, not a battleship, not a carrier. On November 28th, a Japanese midget submarine put a torpedo in her belly. She was loaded with aviation gas, bombs, and rations. She began to burn. The captain, a Commander James M. L. Freeman, did not abandon ship. He ran her aground, beached her right there on the shore of Guadalcanal. For 3 days, as Japanese artillery tried to find their range, the Marines and sailors worked in the burning hold. They formed human chains under the palm trees. They passed boxes, crates, and cans from the smoldering wreck. They saved the ammunition, they saved the bombs, and they saved the spam. Food was a weapon, the most important weapon. A captured Japanese diary taken from the body of a Lieutenant Kenichi Tanemoto described the final days. The pages were stained with mud and something darker. The Americans are loud. We hear their machines. At night, the wind carries a smell from their lines. Not gunpowder, not rot. It is the smell of cooking meat. He wrote about his men, ghosts in the jungle, eating roots, snails, the bark from trees. Ghosts listening to their enemies eat. That was the difference. The crucial, final difference. One army was sustained by an industrial machine 7,000 miles away, a machine that could deliver a hot meal to the gates of hell. The other was sustained by an imperial decree. Bushido could not fill a starving belly. A bayonet charge could not defeat a functioning supply line. The battle for Guadalcanal was not won on the bloody ridges above Henderson Field. It wasn't won in the naval clashes in the dark. It was won in the holds of slow-moving ships. It was won by men like Commander Freeman. It was won, tin by greasy tin. May 16, 1944, Hancock County, Iowa. The letter wasn't from his son. The V-mail stationery was wrong. John Albright, 52 years old, wiped grease from his hands with a rag that smelled of diesel and rich black earth. He stood in the shade of his barn, the midday sun beating down on the corrugated iron roof, making the air shimmer above it. The mail carrier had leaned out of his Ford Model A, holding the envelope like it was something fragile. Something holy. It wasn't a telegram. He thanked God for that. Every day, he thanked God it wasn't a telegram. He slit the thick, creamy paper open with a thumbnail hardened by a lifetime of farming. The letterhead was imposing. The Department of War. It was not about his boy, Corporal James Albright, currently a name on a map somewhere in the vast, terrifying emptiness of the Pacific. It was about his pigs. His pigs had been awarded a citation for meritorious service in the war effort. The document, signed by some undersecretary he had never heard of, spoke of production quotas, of protein units, of caloric density, of a vital contribution to troop morale. John Albright read it twice, his lips moving silently. He looked out over the fields, the vast, flat expanse of Iowa that stretched to a horizon cut only by a distant grain silo. His pigs. His fat, grunting, ordinary pigs, the ones wallowing in the cool mud behind the barn, were heroes. The thought was absurd. It made no sense. And standing there with the smell of manure in his nostrils and the official government paper in his hand, it made all the sense in the world. History remembers the names: Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Savo Island, Iron Bottom Sound. A litany of violence and sacrifice recited in textbooks and preserved in the quiet halls of military museums. We see the grainy black and white footage, Marines storming beaches, their faces taut with fear and adrenaline. Douglas SBD dauntless dive bombers peeling off against a sky pocked with the black flowers of anti-aircraft fire. The thin, defiant line of men and machines at a dirt airstrip called Henderson Field. The names are stones in a national graveyard. The Battle of the Tanaru. Edson's Ridge, the Matanaikau. Bloody Ridge. A neat, clean narrative of courage against overwhelming odds. A story told in bronze statues and solemn remembrances. But that is not the whole story. It is not even the most important part. The men who were there, the ones who survived the fevers and the snipers and the gnawing terror in the dark, they remembered something else. The history books don't have a smell, but Guadalcanal had a smell. The sweet, cloying stench of rot. Rotting vegetation, rotting canvas, rotting flesh. A smell that got into your clothes and your skin and your soul. They remembered the hunger. A deep, cellular hunger that hollowed a man out from the inside. A constant companion. A dull ache that sharpened into a predatory beast at night. It made men weak. It made them careless. A rustle in the bush could be the enemy, or it could be a lizard you might be able to catch and eat. Sometimes the gamble was worth it, sometimes it wasn't. They remembered the Japanese rice, captured and boiled until it was a tasteless gray paste. They remembered the worms in the hardtack, and they remembered the day the food came back. It arrived in rectangular tins, stacked high on pallets, gleaming in the oppressive tropical sun. Blue cans, yellow lettering, Spam. To the accountants at the Pentagon, it was item number 347, canned pork with ham. A line item on a sprawling manifest. To the men on Guadalcanal, it was salvation. It was a greasy, salty, beautiful miracle. It was more than food. It was a message. A 10-ounce telegram from a place called Hancock County, Iowa. A postcard from a world without malaria, without snipers, without the incessant, maddening rain. A message that said, "We have not forgotten you." A message that said, "The machine is working." The great, roaring, unstoppable American machine of farms and factories and railroads was churning out victory, one canned, good at a time. The sound of a P-38 can opener punching through a tin lid was the sound of hope. It was the sound of a promise kept. A heavily redacted post-war analysis by the Army's Quartermaster Corps, a document declassified in 1972 and filed as QMC Document 7B Passy S, made the point with chilling clarity. The document was titled, "An Analysis of Material Deprivation as a Combat Multiplier in the Solomon Islands Campaign." A mouthful. It was a cold document, full of charts and graphs. One graph plotted reported morale incidents against daily caloric intake. The lines were a near-perfect mirror image. As one went up, the other plummeted. The summary concluded, "The primary logistical failure of Imperial Japanese forces was not a lack of ammunition or ordnance, but a fundamental underestimation of the caloric requirements for sustained jungle warfare. The American advantage was not tactical, it was metabolic." The report did not use the word spam. It did not have to. Everyone knew. The Japanese high command never understood. They couldn't. Theirs was a culture of spirit over matter. Bushido. The will to win. They saw the American reliance on material as a weakness, a sign of decadence. They found the diary on a lieutenant named Hayashi, his body recovered near the Gifu perimeter. His last entry, dated November 30th, 1942, was not about the emperor. It was not about honor. "Another day of rain," he wrote in tiny, precise characters. "The hunger is a fire in my belly. I dream of mother's cooking, of a simple bowl of rice with a pickled plum. Sergeant Sato saw a crate of the Americans' canned meat wash ashore. He tried to retrieve it. A sniper shot him. He died for a can of pork. Perhaps that is the logic of this war. Visit the Guadalcanal American Memorial today. It is all clean white stone and solemn inscriptions. It speaks of valor and freedom and the ultimate sacrifice. It tells the official story. But for the men who fought there, the real memorial was never built. It would be a strange monument, a towering sculpture of a GI not with a rifle, but with a P-38 can opener in his hand. Behind him, not a flag, but a mountain of blue and yellow tins. The background would not be an explosion, but the silhouette of a Liberty ship, low in the water, heavy with crates from San Francisco, crates filled with the work of men like John Albright. A commemorative image of the war as it was truly fought, a collision not just of armies, but of factories. A collision of supply chains. After the war, the jokes started. The endless skits on the radio, the cartoons in magazines. Spam became a punchline, a symbol of tacky, low-brow American taste. But for the men of the 1st Marine Division, for the Americal, for anyone who had felt that Guadalcanal hunger, it was never a joke. It was the taste of survival, the salty, greasy taste of one more dawn. They never laughed at the jokes, they just remembered. They remembered the waiting, the emptiness, and then the can. History is written by the victors, they say, but victory is underwritten by the bean counters, by the factory workers, by the farmers. Victory is a matter of paperwork before it is a matter of bloodshed. And on Guadalcanal, the final irrefutable argument was not a bullet, it was a calorie. What truly breaks a soldier? Is it the force of an explosion, or the simple, impossible promise carried on the scent of a hot meal in a world of rot and decay? The official story is sealed in archival ink. It lives in the post-action report from the 41st Infantry Division, a clinical document, a ledger of ordnance spent and objectives taken. It speaks a language of maps and coordinates. It is silent on the real weapon. Silent on the whisper from a lone Australian coast watcher, a ghost in the mountains of Bougainville. Silent on the gamble of Major Frank Hollister, a quartermaster who saw war not as a clash of armies, but as a contest of supply. The report had no room for the smell of fried pork, salty and sublime, a scent so out of place it felt like a hallucination. A message from the world of women in hairnets and men on an assembly line, the world that could produce so much it could afford to throw it away as a lure. They steamed into Iron Bottom Sound, a graveyard of steel. They came as warriors expecting to fight men. Instead, they were defeated by an idea of overwhelming abundance. The starving soldier on the line saw not a can of meat. He saw the end of his world. He saw a power that did not need to hoard its resources, a power that could not possibly be defeated. History prefers the simplicity of battle lines. It avoids the complexity of psychology. The truth breathed somewhere else, between the lines of the report. Between the diesel-soaked hands of a mechanic named John Albright and the silent ghosts of the Canberra and the Quincy, between the hunger in one man's belly and the sheer casual power in another's. This was never a story of strategy. It was always a story of surrender, not to a superior force of arms, but to a superior force of being. One nation's waste was another's wonder. The numbers tell one story. The real story is in the transformation, in how an enemy becomes a captive, not through violence, but through a glimpse of a world he cannot comprehend. The official records are silent, but the question still hangs in the humid air, as potent and as fleeting as the scent that started it all. What other wars were won not on the battlefield, but in the mind? What secrets still die with those who kept them? What is truly being fought for when a can of spiced ham can end a war?